Seattle, winter 1994. The city seemed to have been swallowed by its own rain. It was one of those weeks when the sky never cleared, the wind bit your face, and the sound of water lapping against rooftops mingled with the roar of clogged drains. In the historic downtown area, in Old Pioneer Square, the asphalt began to give way in the middle of the night. A strange, irregularly shaped hole opened up between the streetlights and old shops. At first, no one paid much attention. After all, landslides were common at that time of year. But this time, something was different. The hole seemed too deep, as if it had been dug from within, not simply eroded by the rain. When city workers arrived that morning, armed with flashlights and ropes, the air smelled thick with rust and mildew, the kind that sticks in your throat and won't go away even after several coughs. They believed they were just going to find another tunnel in Seattle's old underground, the one that became an urban legend after the city was rebuilt on 19th-century ruins. It was almost a curious journey for them, until the moment the first one descended. The sound of metal scraping against the wall echoed, and the silence that followed seemed to last for too long. One of the men called out nervously to his colleague, asking him to look at what he was seeing. The flashlight trembled in his hands as the beam revealed the corridor ahead. It wasn't an old tunnel. The walls were new, smooth, as if recently dug, and the detail. That froze everyone. There wasn't the narrow space or the smell of wet earth. It was the marks, small handprints, hundreds of them, etched into the mud and cement wall, some dripping as if left by children trying to escape. One of the men swore he heard a muffled sound, like a sob coming from deep within. Another laughed, saying it was just the echo, but no one wanted to check. The engineer in charge arrived hours later, ordering the access sealed off until further analysis. But the rumor had already spread among residents. They said the ancient tunnels were awakening. And as night fell again over Seattle, a detail began to draw the attention of curious onlookers approaching the isolated area. The hole seemed to be pulsing, as if the wind coming out of it was coming from somewhere much deeper than the city's underground, and what no one imagined was that the escaping cold air carried something more than the smell of wet earth. It carried a warning. It's impossible to hear a story like this and not feel that shiver slowly creep up your spine, right? Because deep down, those here aren't just curious. They're people who truly feel the weight of every silence, every step taken in the dark, every clue that changes everything at the last second. This is the place for those who believe that stories of disappearances, mysteries, and twists deserve to be told the right way, with emotion, truth, and respect. It's the space for those who understand that behind every case lies a life that cannot be forgotten. So come be part of this community that listens with its heart and rejoices with each new discovery, because the next case could be even more intense than this one. Press the button, subscribe, leaves the like to show that you're in this together, and prepare your heart, because what comes after the Seattle Underground is something no one was ready to see. The rain was still falling heavily when Lara McConnell's phone rang for the first time that morning. She was still standing at the window, watching the drops run down the apartment glass, trying to find a moment of silence amid the constant noise of the city. She'd slept little, as usual. The sound of the phone seemed to come from somewhere distant, yet familiar. Deep down, Lara knew it wasn't just any call. She felt it, the way only those who live immersed in missing persons cases can. It was the kind of premonition that comes without proof, but with a kind of weight on the chest, as if the body warns before the mind understands. When she answered, on the other end was Sergeant Miller from the incident center. His voice was tense, dry, blunt. "They've opened a fissure in Pioneer Square, right downtown. They found something strange down there, and they want us close by." Lara frowned, straightened her coat, and even though she didn't quite understand, grabbed her keys and left. She knew every street in Seattle, every alley, every corner dampened by time. It was like walking through a city, made of memories, some good, others she'd rather bury. She'd become a missing persons detective after her own brother, Daniel, disappeared when she was just 10 years old. It was one of those cases with no body, no trace, no answers. Her mother never recovered, and her father simply stopped talking. Since then, Lara lived with a silent certainty. Every disappearance has an explanation, even if the world refuses to see it. As she drove through the flooded streets, she remembered her brother's face, the futile searches, the broken promises by the local police. That was why she never again trusted protocols, nor reports, without sufficient evidence. For her, every detail mattered, every glance, every shadow, and perhaps it was this obsessive way of looking at things that made her one of the best on her team, or the most feared. She had confronted superiors, ignored orders, reopened closed investigations, but she had also paid the price: long suspensions, suspicious looks, and the inevitable loneliness of those who carry their own sense of justice as a shield. When she reached the isolated area, the scene was almost surreal. Police cars flashing, the muffled sound of radios communicating codes, city workers in soaked uniforms, and the smell of freshly dug earth mixed with rust. The ground was cracked in the middle of the street, as if something had pushed it from within. One of the workers, a grey-haired man with mud-stained hands, approached and said in a low voice, "You need to see this for yourself." Lara waved and continued on, dodging wires and puddles. She carefully descended the makeshift ladder that led to the opening. The air below was heavy, cold, almost paralyzing. The beams of the lanterns danced on the walls, revealing a narrow passageway not found on any official map. And then she saw the marks, the same ones that had become rumored in recent hours. Small hands, many of them, scattered across the damp walls. They seemed recently left, still damp with mud. Lara brought her face closer and lightly touched one of the marks with her fingers. It was impossible not to feel a shiver. Something about that touch felt almost human, as if the wall had retained a trace of life. One of the engineers explained that Seattle's old tunnels, built after the Great Fire of 1889, were meters below that point. This wasn't part of the original system. It was new, and if it was new, someone had built it. Lara looked back down the dark corridor ahead, and for a moment she swore she saw something move, but no one else saw it. The technician turned off the flashlight, saying they were going to seal the access until a new inspection, and she just nodded. But something inside her told her this wasn't the kind of place you close and forget. Back on the surface, Lara stood still for a few minutes, observing the activity. The press was already trying to get closer, sniffing out headlines, but she knew what was happening. There was bigger than any news story. In the car seat, she opened her notebook and wrote just one sentence: "The hands are still here." It was her way of remembering what she felt. She never fully trusted her memory. She preferred paper, the firm line, the cold recording of her thoughts, before doubts ate away at them. On the way back, traffic was slow and fog was beginning to settle over the city. Lara turned on the radio, more out of habit than interest, and an old song began to play. For a second she considered turning it off, but let it play. It was the same song Daniel had been listening to on his father's tape player the day he disappeared. Her heart sank, and the steering wheel felt heavier. She took a deep breath, trying to push the past away, but the memory lingered, like a shadow that never fades. At home, the apartment was cold and silent. Her daughter, Megan, had already left for school. The walls were covered with old photos, newspaper clippings, maps with colored pins, a collection of memories and ghosts. Lara took off her coat, poured coffee, and stood staring at the stacks of folders on the table. Each one represented a name, a life, a story interrupted. And, as hard as it was to admit, some of those folders would never be finished. She knew that, but the Pioneer Square case felt different. There was something about that crack, those marks, that tugged at a part of her that still believed in answers. Hours later, the phone rang again. A colleague from the division was calling to say the captain wanted a full report by the next morning. Lara replied that she was already working on it, even though she had almost nothing on hand. The thing is, as she spoke, she noticed something curious. The stuffed rabbit Megan always left on the bookshelf was missing. She quickly searched for it and found it lying near the window covered in dirt. Megan hadn't been home since the night before, and the toy still smelled of rain. Her stomach churned, but she tried not to jump to conclusions. Still, her instinct spoke louder. Something was about to change. Dawn arrived without sleep, and Lara spent hours reviewing old photos, trying to connect what she saw in that tunnel with cold cases of missing children from the 1980s. There were dozens of them, all with one thing in common. They disappeared in neighborhoods near the underground. She traced circles on the map and realized that if she connected the dots, she formed a winding line cutting through the city, like a hidden route invisible to those who don't know where to look. Outside, the wind beat hard against the windows, and there, alone with the sound of rain and the echoing memories, Lara felt a feeling she hadn't felt in years. The same feeling she'd felt when she was a child and realized her brother wouldn't be coming home. A mixture of fear and certainty. That crack in Pioneer Square wasn't just a fault in the ground. It was an open door, and someone or something had already passed through it. The next morning, Seattle still seemed stuck in that constant grey that never let the sky lighten. Lara arrived at the police station early, wearing the same dark, rain-soaked coat and a lukewarm coffee in her hand. The atmosphere was bustling, but she barely noticed the noise. Since the night before, that image had been in her mind. The small marks on the damp walls, the clay hands, the newly discovered corridor hidden beneath the city. She had the feeling something was trying to find her, as if those walls were silently screaming. Opening the preliminary report left on her desk, her heart leaped. Enclosed was an enlarged photograph of what one of the workers had recovered from the scene, a torn, dingy piece of fabric with a small blue button sewn crookedly on it. Lara knew exactly what it was, a barely visible detail but impossible to forget. She had seen that button before, in the photos of one of the missing children, little Elliot Moore, missing since 1987. Her body tensed. She closed the folder, looked around and discreetly put the document away. None of her colleagues seemed to care. To them it was just another irrelevant item, another isolated find in an old, damp place. But to Lara, it was the first real clue in a long time, the kind of clue that doesn't appear by chance. She pulled Elliot's file from the old shelves covered in dust. The last entry in the case was dated 9 years earlier and ended with a chilling sentence, cold as the concrete of the tunnels. Case closed due to lack of evidence. That made her swallow hard. She sat down, spread the photos out on the table, and compared the fabric she found with the child's clothing in the original image. It was the same pattern, the same blue button sewn on by the mother, according to the report. Her mind raced. The old Seattle Underground, the disappearances of the 1980s, the research failures, none of it was a coincidence. And the more she thought, the more she remembered old stories of desperate families she herself had interviewed. Many of the disappearances occurred in areas near the old tunnel entrances. No one had ever cross-referenced this information before. No one wanted to see what was beneath their feet. The problem was that, for Lara, this kind of coincidence was the basis of every discovery and also the beginning of every nightmare. Determined, she printed the photos and pinned them to a makeshift bulletin board next to her desk. Each image seemed a reminder of how often the system failed, how many families were left behind. As she scribbled possible connections on the board, Miller appeared in the doorway with that mocking tone he used when he wanted to provoke her. "Still hunting ghosts, McConnell?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. She didn't respond. She continued drawing lines between the dots on the map. He insisted that the Fisher case would be passed on to the construction team, that it had nothing to do with the missing persons division. Lara slowly turned her head and replied with a firm look. "Then that explains why there's a piece of the shirt of a boy who disappeared 9 years ago inside that tunnel." Miller fell silent, looked at the bulletin board, and left without saying anything. For a moment, she felt the weight of silence, the kind of silence that precedes something important, something that doesn't yet have a name. The sound of rain was beating against the windows again, the drops seeming to match the rapid rhythm of her heart. She picked up the phone and called the Central Archive, requesting all reports of missing children between 1985 and 1994. The operator grumbled, saying it would take time. Lara replied that she would wait. She knew how to wait. After all, she'd been waiting for answers since childhood. Hours passed, and when he finally received the reports, he spread them out on the table like a puzzle. Every name, every date, every street. Little by little, he began to notice a pattern. The children disappeared within a specific 2-mile radius of known underground entrances. In many cases, the families lived near old renovated buildings where no one had ever inspected the ground. It was as if there were a subterranean thread connecting all these stories, a hidden trail beneath the city, invisible to those living above ground. As she analyzed the notes, a shiver ran down her spine. The feeling was clear. Someone had used the old underground, not as a shelter, but as a route. And if it was a route, it led somewhere. But where? She didn't have that answer yet. The clock read almost 10 o'clock when she turned off the lights in the room and stood there, staring at the mural illuminated only by the dim light from the hallway. The photos, the maps, the faces of the missing children, they all seemed to be looking back at her, begging her not to let this die like the other cases. In the parking lot, already inside the car, Lara stood for a few minutes with the engine off, just listening to the sound of rain on the windshield. I thought about how often people drive over something without understanding what lies beneath. How many stories are lost for lack of someone willing to listen to what the silence is trying to say. She took a deep breath, started the car, and glanced in the rearview mirror. The image of the police station building receded, but her gaze remained fixed. She knew that from then on, nothing would be simple. And, strangely, that familiar feeling of unease began to grow in her chest. The same one she'd felt the day her brother disappeared. As she drove home, the city lights reflected off the wet windows, and for a moment she thought she saw something move in the reflection. She turned quickly, but there was no one there. Only the sound of the windshield wipers, steady, hypnotic. Still, the chill down her spine didn't go away. Maybe it was just fatigue, or maybe not. As she parked, she saw the police tape still marking off part of the Pioneer Square street in the distance. The wind carried the sound of distant sirens, and the rain was relentless. Lara stood, staring in the direction where it all began, and a doubt gripped her. What if those handprints weren't just there by chance? What if they had been left for someone to find? All night long, Lara couldn't sleep. The sound of rain was constant, and the wind pounding against the windows seemed to echo the same noise she'd heard inside the tunnel. A muffled, irregular sound, as if something were moving slowly. Underground. Sitting at the kitchen table, with the lights off and only the lamp illuminating her notebook, she tried to organize her thoughts. The last few hours had been too intense. The scrap of fabric with the blue button, the map of the disappearances, the connection to the tunnels. It was as if an ancient puzzle were coming together, but missing pieces, and perhaps the most important ones, were still hidden somewhere no one dared look. Lara was known among her peers for seeing patterns where others saw coincidences. It was almost an instinct, a form of survival. As a child, she used to say her brother left signs for her, scribbled drawings, small messages hidden in unlikely places. After he disappeared, she spent years trying to decipher what each symbol meant, as if there were a code she hadn't grasped in time. Now, looking at those handprints on the underground walls, the feeling was the same. The pattern was there, invisible to the hurried eye, but screaming at anyone brave enough to look deeper. In the morning, she returned to the police station. The place had that smell of burnt coffee and damp paper that only old buildings carry. No one seemed particularly interested in what she was doing, which was good. Fewer eyes on her work meant more freedom to follow her instincts. She turned on the projector and began comparing the dates of the disappearances with the underground construction work registered by the city. The coincidences were absurd. Each disappearance occurred during a period when the city's sewage or drainage system was undergoing renovations. It was as if someone was taking advantage of the excavation activity to hide something in the tunnels. But why? And most importantly, who? As he reviewed the reports, he noticed a detail no one had noticed before. In every case, the families reported the same pattern of behavior before the disappearance. The children commented on sounds coming from the ground, thumps, footsteps, distant voices, and in some cases even mentioned a man under the street. These descriptions had been dismissed at the time, dismissed as childish imagination. But now, after what she saw in Pioneer Square, it no longer seemed so harmless. Lara wrote on a piece of paper, "The children listened before disappearing." The day wore on and she immersed herself completely in the investigation, connecting clippings, reports, and old files. Piles of documents filled her desk, but she ignored them. The phone rang, interrupting her train of thought. It was the city's cartographer, a man named Nolan who must have been in his late 80s but still knew every inch of the ancient tunnels. He said he'd seen the news about the sinkhole in Pioneer Square and wanted to talk to her. They arranged to meet late that afternoon at a small cafe downtown. Nolan arrived with a huge folder of yellowed maps, the kind of paper that reeks of history. He said that Seattle's underground wasn't as simple as public records made it out to. So there were entire sections erased from the maps, tunnels officially closed decades ago but which, he said, still existed. And worse, some still had power in isolated spots. Lara listened intently, her heart racing. Nolan opened one of the maps and pointed to an area called Sector E, an underground network built in 1912 and sealed after a landslide. "No one's been in there for over 50 years, he said, lowering his voice, "but I've heard stories of people who tried and never came back." She asked to copy the map and thanked him, but before Nolan left he added something that made her blood run cold. "You know what's strange?" he said. "These tunnels were reinforced in the 1980s, but there's no record of who authorized it. No contracts, no identified teams, as if someone worked there in secret." Lara fell silent, staring at the map. The date coincided exactly with the beginning of the string of child disappearances. Back in the car, she left the map on the passenger seat and stood for a few minutes trying to process everything. Outside, traffic was slow, and the city seemed stuck in a state of waiting, as if something were about to happen. She ran her fingers over the paper, tracing the line connecting the tunnels to Pioneer Square. The route made sense, and now she had a direction. That night, when she got home, Megan was already asleep. Lara watched her daughter for a few minutes, her face serene, her hands small. She thought about how many mothers had lost. Children without even understanding why. How many of them had believed it was chance, fate, bad luck. What if it was all part of something bigger, something planned? The thought was unbearable, but also impossible to ignore. Before falling asleep, she mentally reviewed everything she had discovered. The handprints, the blue button, the map, the tunnels erased from official records. Each piece seemed to pull her deeper into this spiral of mystery. Deep down, she knew she was beginning to connect, dots that many would rather leave forgotten. And the closer she got to the truth, the more the city seemed to react. Lights flickered, radios faltered, and at times she had the distinct feeling she was being watched. In the middle of the night, she woke with a start to a sound coming from the hallway, a sharp crack followed by a soft scraping sound on the floor. She grabbed her flashlight and went into the living room. The wind blew the curtains, and Megan's stuffed rabbit lay on the floor, covered in dirt again. Her heart raced. The window was closed. There was no sign of a break-in, nothing out of place, just the toy, and the smell of damp clay, the same as in the tunnel. Lara leaned against the wall and took a deep breath, trying to convince herself it was a coincidence, but she knew it wasn't. Something from underground was trying to climb up. She sat down, rabbit in hand, and remained there, motionless, for long minutes. The sound of rain filled the silence again, and the clock struck 3 in the morning. She glanced at the map Nolan had given her, still open on the table, and noticed something she hadn't noticed before. A small circle drawn in pencil, right in the center of Pioneer Square. A dot with no label. Sector E began there. Her breathing grew heavy, her gaze fixed on that spot. And for the first time, Lara had the distinct feeling that the underground wasn't what everyone thought. It wasn't just beneath the city. It was alive, waiting. She woke before sunrise, her eyes burning and her head throbbing. The map was still open on the table, stained with coffee and bearing notes hastily scribbled throughout the night. The circle in the center of Pioneer Square seemed to pulse every time she looked at it, as if silently saying, "Come back here." Lara knew she couldn't ignore it. It was the kind of feeling she knew well, the beginning of something others would call obsession, but for her, it was simply the instinct of someone who senses when the truth is near. She put on her coat, tied up her hair, and left without breakfast, her gaze fixed and her heart racing. The atmosphere at the police station was tense. People whispered, superiors pretended not to notice their movements, and Miller once again appeared with that smile of someone who doesn't take anything seriously. "Again with this tunnel story, McConnell," he said, leaning against the wall. "The captain ordered this closed. He said there's no evidence of any crime." Lara let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Of course there's no evidence. No one's looking where they should." Miller tried to argue, but she simply took her badge and left it on the desk. "So write it down, Miller. It's not the department investigating now. It's me." And she left. The rain was getting heavier, as if the entire weather conspired to push Seattle deeper into its own darkness. Lara drove to Pioneer Square, parked a few blocks away, and walked to the closed-off area. The area was still fenced off, but the workers had left because of the bad weather. Only the sound of falling water and the distant echo of traffic filled the air. She stepped over the tape, shone a flashlight into the hole, and carefully climbed down. The smell of mold and rust was stronger now, and at the bottom of the tunnel the air felt different. warmer, as if something was breathing there. She advanced cautiously. Her boots sank into the mud, and the flashlight's beam wavered with each breath. The handprints were still. On the walls, only they seemed clearer now, as if they had been left recently. Lara approached and noticed that some were smaller than others, almost the size of a baby's palm. Her chest tightened. Suddenly, something glinted among the rubble, a metal fragment covered in mud. She picked it up and wiped it with her thumb. A child's bracelet, engraved with the name Elliot, the same name she had read on the blue button. Her heart raced again. The sound of water droplets falling from the ceiling sounded like the ticking of a clock, louder and closer with each passing second. She peered down the tunnel, where the darkness grew so dense her flashlight couldn't reach. For a moment, she thought she heard something, a faint whisper, a shallow breath. She called out, but her own voice sounded distant, muffled. "Is anyone there?" she asked, and the echo returned the question as if mocking her. Fear was accompanied by adrenaline, the kind of rush that precedes real danger. She knew she should go back, but something kept making her stay. Suddenly, a metallic crack echoed to the left. He turned quickly, shining his flashlight, but there was no one there. Only the sound of water running through old pipes and the distant rustling of something moving. The tension in the air was almost palpable. Each step she took seemed to echo in multiple directions, as if she weren't alone. On the ground, she noticed a set of small, recent footprints leading toward a seemingly solid wall. She followed the trail, touched the concrete, and felt a slight, almost imperceptible vibration, as if behind the wall lay a hollow passage. She picked up a fallen iron bar and began tapping lightly. The sound confirmed it. Hollow. She tried pushing, forcing, until a section of the wall gave way, revealing a dark crevice. A warm wind blew out, bringing a strong smell of earth and something sweet, sickening, the smell of ancient decay. The flashlight flickered for a moment, and when the light returned, she saw something that made her freeze. A drawing, drawn in white chalk, right on the inner wall of the newly revealed corridor. A sequence of symbols resembling interlocking circles, and in the center, the same name written in shaky letters, Elliot. Lara took a step back, trying to understand what she saw. The writing looked childish, but the lines were desperate, as if rushed. She photographed everything, even with trembling hands. She knew it changed everything. It wasn't just a hole in the ground anymore. Someone had used that place, and recently, and worst of all, it seemed like they were trying to leave a message. As she climbed back to the surface, she heard that muffled sound coming from inside the tunnel again, a rhythmic, distant noise that could have been anything, wind, dripping, or footsteps. When she finally emerged onto the street, the chilly, early morning air made her breathe heavily. Her entire body trembled, not just from the cold, but from something deeper, the instinct of someone who knows they've touched something they shouldn't. Back in the car, she turned on the heater and stood there for long minutes, watching her face reflected in the rearview mirror. She was pale, her eyes sunken, but her gaze was steady. She picked up her camera, reviewed the photos, and enlarged the wall design. In the corner, almost faded, was a word written in red paint, too small to see in the dark. When she zoomed in, she read it clearly. Help. Her heart raced. He closed the camera, slumped against the bench, and took a deep breath. His head was buzzing with questions, but one thing was clear. Those children had tried to leave a trail, and no one ever noticed. The entire town lived on a secret that breathed beneath their feet, and what Lara didn't yet know was that, as she stood there trying to process what she'd just seen, someone was watching her from afar, inside a black car parked across the street, headlights off, engine off, the kind of presence that makes no sound, but changes the air around it. She felt something, a shiver that ran down her spine and made her glance in the rearview mirror. Nothing. Just the rain, the wind, the distant sound of a church bell striking 4 in the morning. He put the car in gear, accelerated, and disappeared into the fog. But as the car pulled away, the camera in her passenger seat was still recording, and the last frame captured the partially open tunnel, with a new handprint on the wall, damp, fresh, too small to be an adult's. The following days were a mixture of exhaustion, anger, and a constant feeling of being watched. Lara was no longer sleeping well, eating little, and living surrounded by piles of notes scattered throughout the house. What had begun as a simple city inspection now consumed every waking moment of her life. She knew she was close to something big, but each step forward was costly. Her head throbbed, her eyes burned, and her mind seemed to never shut down. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw those small hands marked on the walls, smelled the damp earth, and felt the strange heat rising from the depths of the tunnel. It was as if something down there was calling her name. At work, isolation became inevitable. Colleagues began to avoid long conversations, some even looking away when she passed. The captain called her twice for formal meetings, trying to convince her to drop the case, but she refused. She knew the dossier on her behavior must already be being prepared, and she didn't care. Since her brother's disappearance, she had already lost almost everything that mattered. Now she felt she owed it to herself and to all the children who never had their stories told in full. The problem was, this determination came at a cost. Megan. The daughter began to feel her mother's absence, the long nights away from home, the curt answers, and the distant look in her eyes. Lara promised it would only be a few more days, but she'd been saying that for weeks. Megan tried to understand, but the tension between them grew like an invisible crack. One night the girl asked point blank, "You still think about Uncle Daniel, right?" Lara paused, unsure of how to respond. Yes, she thought about him every day. She thought that maybe her brother had gone through the same tunnels, that maybe no one had looked hard enough. What if what she was discovering now was the same thing that happened to him? The thought tortured her. Deep down, Lara knew her investigation was treading a fine line between courage and self-destruction. Her body craved rest, but her mind wouldn't let her. She began drinking more coffee, taking medication to help her sleep, and living in a constant state of alert. She spent hours looking at maps, reviewing photos, trying to understand the hidden pattern among the disappearances. Each new discovery took her further away from normal life, from her daughter, from her friends, from her own sanity, and the further she strayed, the more she felt she was becoming alone in this search. That week he decided to go back underground. She knew it was reckless. She knew she shouldn't do it alone, but she couldn't help herself. Her instinct to find answers overcame her fear. She took ropes, a spare flashlight, water, and a portable recorder. Before leaving, she left a note on the kitchen table. "I'll be back soon. Don't turn out the lights." Megan was asleep, and she didn't even have the courage to say goodbye. Arriving at Pioneer Square, the weather was eerie. The street was deserted, and the wind sent papers flying through the puddles. The access to the hole was still sealed, but Lara knew another way, an old maintenance access that Nolan had marked on the map. It was a forgotten iron cover in a side alley, covered in years of grime. With effort, he lifted the cover and climbed down the rusty ladder. The metallic sound echoed like a warning, but she ignored it. Downstairs, the air was hotter than before, and the smell worse. A sweet, almost suffocating odor. He turned on the flashlight and began recording. November 23rd, commencing sweep of the south entrance. Ambient temperature, high, fresh moisture marks. Her voice shook, but her tone was controlled, almost professional. She walked slowly, studying the walls. The handprints were still there, but they were different now. Some seemed deeper, as if someone had pressed hard. Others were stacked, one on top of the other, as if several people had tried to escape at once. Suddenly something clinked on the ground. A small, broken, mud-stained gold chain. Lara bent down and picked it up. On the pendant were the initials MM, Megan McConnell. Her blood ran cold. Her entire body froze for a second. The ground seemed to spin and the flashlight trembled in her hands. She knew that chain. It was her daughter's, a birthday present for Megan's 10th birthday. But how had it gotten down there? He tried to control his breathing, but panic began to take over. He screamed. His daughter's name, his voice echoing off the walls like an avalanche. "Megan!" Nothing. Only the sound of his own scream echoing back. He ran down the hallway, his footsteps echoing too loudly, the air growing heavy. Every corner seemed the same, and the feeling of claustrophobia grew. The flashlight blinked twice and went out. He remained in absolute silence for a few seconds, trying to calm his mind. He turned on the backup flashlight, its beam trembling as he made his way around a narrow curve. Up ahead he saw something, a shadow, fleeting, disappearing between the tunnel's columns. It seemed small, fast, Running wasn't a good idea, but she ran anyway. The sound of her footsteps mingled with her heartbeat. She turned the corner and nothing. Just an old mutilated doll lying on the floor, the same stuffed rabbit Megan kept on the bed. Lara picked it up, her gaze fixed and empty. Her voice came out in a whisper. It can't be. The wall ahead bore new marks, fresh, wet. She ran. Her fingers through it and felt the still damp clay. And between her small hands a different one, larger, elongated, marked with a violent pressure. It was that of an adult. Lara swallowed. It was becoming increasingly clear. She wasn't alone there. And worst of all, whatever was in that basement knew her daughter. Exhaustion, fear, and despair began to merge. Lara leaned against the wall, trying to understand how everything had turned out this way. The entire city seemed asleep as she descended, deeper and deeper into a living nightmare. She wept silently for a few seconds, but then wiped her face angrily. No, not now. She knew that if she lost control, she would be swallowed up by this place, as the other children had been. And it was in that moment, between pain and determination, that an idea struck. If the pattern was real, someone must have created it. And if someone was responsible for all this, they might still be nearby. Lara took a deep breath and picked up the recorder. Her voice came out steady, even though it trembled. If anyone's listening, I've found the route. It exists, but I'm not alone here. The next sound was a dull thud, like a stone falling in the distance, followed by something else. A gasp, very close. She turned off the flashlight, her heart hammering in her chest, and stood still in the pitch black. From deep within, a faint, drawn-out voice whispered her name. Lara never forgot that sound, a childish voice, but too familiar to be a stranger's. And, in that instant, between fear and impulse, she realized that the Seattle Underground held something that connected all the disappearances, including the most painful of her life. That voice echoing her name inside the tunnel stuck in Lara's head for days. It was impossible to forget the tone, the drawn-out intonation, the way the sound seemed to come from within the walls rather than from a physical body. She still trembled when she remembered it. Her body told her to stop, but her mind, addicted to clues, wouldn't let her. When she finally found the strength to return to the police station, she was no longer the same woman. She had dark circles under her eyes, a lost look in her eyes, and a kind of silent rage trapped between her teeth. No one dared ask what had happened. The report she delivered was dry, direct, and emotionless, but between the lines there was a message few would understand. Someone was using the underground, and that someone was still down there. It was on the third day after the incident that she finally got a more concrete lead. She spent the morning reviewing old city records, looking for any mention of undocumented renovations or the names of employees who might have had access to the underground area during the 1980s and 1990s. Most of the files were incomplete or simply missing, but one detail caught her eye. A name repeated on several inspection sheets. Harold Finch at first. He seemed like just another janitor of the municipal drainage system. But the more Lara read, the more his name appeared, linked to different departments on dates that didn't make sense. Finch signed reports for projects occurring simultaneously in distant parts of the city, something impossible, unless they were falsified. Lara printed everything and began to piece together a timeline. Finch worked for the city for almost 30 years and officially retired in 1995, shortly after the last wave of disappearances. His address was listed in a remote neighborhood near Lake Union, but the document was incomplete with no house number. His wife had died years before with no children registered. He seemed like an invisible man, the kind who goes unnoticed even when he's right in front of you. And for some reason, that name was in all the wrong places. Determined, she decided to drive to the address on her own. The neighborhood was old, full of dilapidated Victorian houses and trees that seemed to have grown over the power lines. When she parked the car, she noticed the air was different here. Cold, damp, almost still. Finch's house was standing but in disrepair. The windows were boarded up, the gate overgrown with ivy, the garden swallowed by weeds. Lara took a deep breath and pushed open the gate, which creaked like a warning. He climbed the 3 steps to the porch, each step accompanied by the creaking of rotting wood. He knocked on the door impulsively, even though he knew no one would answer. The echo sounded hollow, returning only the sound of rain. He tried the doorknob. Locked. He looked around, saw a partially open side window and decided to enter. The smell inside was strong, a mixture of mildew and rust. The walls were covered in old newspapers, headlines of child disappearances pasted like part of a sickening mural. Some had cut-out photos, others were scrawled with red marker, forming a chaotic pattern. In the center of the room, an old table held dozens of VHS tapes, some with handwritten labels. 1986, School, 1991, East. Corridor, 1994, Tunnel 3. Lara's stomach churned. She grabbed a random tape and inserted it into an old player that was still plugged in. The image hissed for a few seconds before stabilizing. The video showed a tunnel, the same type she had explored, with a swinging camera, probably attached to a helmet. In the corner of the screen, a childlike shadow moved quickly, and a male voice said something barely audible. "Quiet. Be quiet." Lara immediately turned off the video, her heart racing. She stood motionless for a few seconds, staring at the black screen. Then she noticed another detail. From deep within the house, behind a half-open door, came a rhythmic sound. She approached slowly, the floorboards creaking under her feet. He pushed open the door, revealing a staircase leading down. The earthy smell was the same as he'd smelled in the tunnels. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing brick walls and a narrow corridor that ran underground. The floor was covered in old footprints, boot prints, and small bare footprints. In the middle of the corridor sat a metal chair, and hanging above it was a janitor's uniform with a dusty name tag, Harold Finch. Lara stopped, goosebumps all over her body. It was impossible to know if the man was still alive, but everything indicated that this was the epicenter of what she had been hunting for weeks. The place where the ordinary monster worked, the kind of person no one suspects, who lives on the next street, who helps build what others don't even see, the kind of figure society calls invisible, until the day the secrets come to light. She photographed everything, recorded every detail, and before climbing up, she noticed a box in the corner covered with cloth. Inside were dozens of children's objects, toys, shoes, scraps of clothing, hair ties. Each had a paper label and a date. One of them was a broken gold bracelet, just like the one she had found in the tunnel. The paper attached to it read, 1995. McConnell. Lara nearly dropped the recorder. Her breath caught, her entire body tingled. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a message. He knew about her. He knew about Megan. And somehow, this man, or what was left of him, was entwined in this story long before she began investigating. Her mind was spinning in circles. Everything made sense, and yet nothing did. Harold Finch wasn't just the antagonist from the past. He was the link between the missing children, the tunnels, and perhaps even Lara's brother's disappearance decades earlier. And if he was still alive, he wouldn't be just a ghost from the underground, but something far more dangerous. The sound of light footsteps from above interrupted her thoughts. Lara instinctively turned off the flashlight and stood still, her heart pounding in her ears. Someone was there. The floorboards on the upper floor creaked, slow, deliberate. The dim light of a match flickered for a moment, then went out, and in the silence, a hoarse, drawling voice which seemed to chuckle said softly, "You shouldn't have come back, Detective." Lara's body reacted before her reasoning could even grasp what was happening. Her heart raced, her hands sweated, and the flashlight slipped slightly from her fingers. The voice that had echoed from above sounded aged, scratchy, but it carried something that made her freeze. Familiarity, that drawling way of pronouncing the words. It was as if the entire past had decided to reappear there, inside that damp, silent house. She lay still, trying to control her breathing. Each creak from the floor above sounded like a footstep toward the stairs, and for a brief moment, dread gave way to anger. Anger at herself for having come all this way alone, anger at the system that had ignored those voices for so many years, and anger at knowing, deep down, that she was about to lose another person she loved. Without much thought, she turned off the flashlight and leaned against the wall, hiding in the shadows. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped directly above her. The silence that followed was the worst kind of silence, the one that comes before something happens. Then, suddenly, a loud, dry crack. The trapdoor lid opened, and a faint beam of light cut through the darkness. Lara held her breath, waiting. Nothing. Just the hiss of wind passing between the boards. When she finally dared to look up, she saw the outline of a face, old, thin, warped by time and dirt. The hollow eyes seemed to see beyond the darkness. Harold Finch. He didn't say anything right away. He just watched her, as if he recognized something in her. Then, with a frightening calm, he murmured, "You're too late." Lara felt the ground disappear for a second. The voice was identical to the one on the tape. The same tone that said, "Quiet, be quiet." It was him. The man the tunnels hid. The man the city had forgotten. And before she could react, Finch began descending the steps, slowly, dragging one foot, holding an old lantern that cast crooked shadows across the walls. Lara backed away, trying to gauge the distance between them, searching for an exit. But something about Finch made her stop. His gaze wasn't just cold, it was confused, almost sad, as if he'd been trapped in a nightmare for a long time. "The children, where did you take them?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Finch stopped, tilting his head to the side, as if trying to remember something distant. "Down? They wanted to get out of the rain," he replied, his tone childish, his words scratchy. "But the ground spoke to me." Her stomach lurched. He was delirious, or worse, he believed what he was saying. She tried to approach slowly, keeping her gaze fixed on him. "Where is my daughter, Harold?" His name came out like a blade, cutting through the heavy air. For a second, his face hardened. "Your daughter," he repeated, and a low laugh escaped. Ah, the girl with the sad eyes. She heard it too, everyone hears it. He raised the lantern and pointed it toward the end of the tunnel behind her. "They're calling down there. The voices. They want company." Lara turned her head reflexively, shining the light down the hallway, but saw nothing. When she looked back, Finch was gone. Only the sound of his shuffling footsteps retreating. She ran to the stairs and climbed them, but the upper floor was empty. The windows were still sealed, the front door locked. It was as if he had dissolved into thin air. The lantern, however, remained lit, left on the table, illuminating the newspaper clippings. And it was there, among the old headlines, that she saw something that made her blood run cold. A photo of Daniel, her missing brother, with a handwritten note, 1983, first on the list. Lara collapsed into her chair, breathless. Finch not only knew her family, he'd been watching her for decades. Her brother's disappearance hadn't been a coincidence. It was the beginning of everything. The underground, the tunnels, the children, all taken by someone who saw it as some kind of sick mission. She looked at the note again. The handwriting matched the tags found on the victim's toys, and right in the corner of the photo, there was a recent date written in red ink, November 24th, the next day. The realization hit her like a punch. Finch wasn't running away. He was planning something that would involve another child, and now Lara knew exactly who he would choose. Megan. Her body reacted before her mind caught up. She ran to her car and sped through the wet Seattle streets, her heart pounding so hard it seemed to drown out the sound of the engine. Streetlights flashed past the windows, blurring everything. The only thing echoing in her head was his voice. "They want company." And for the first time in years, Lara felt real fear, the kind that comes not from the unknown, but from certainty. She arrived home, panting, screaming her daughter's name. Silence, no sound, no movement. The lights were still on, as in the note she'd left. On the couch, the stuffed rabbit, and on it, a piece of paper folded in four, smeared with mud, with shaky handwriting. Lara opened it slowly. Just 2 words. She heard. The air drained from her lungs. The ground seemed to spin, her body wouldn't obey. The clock read 3:17 a.m. And it was in that instant, in the cruelest silence of her life, that Lara understood what Finch had meant by, "You came too late." But what he didn't know, and neither did the Seattle Underground seem to know, is that she wouldn't stop there. Because if Finch believed he'd taken everything she loved, it was because he still didn't know what a mother is capable of when she hears the sound of emptiness where her daughter's voice should be. Lara couldn't quite remember how she'd left home that early morning. She only realized she was driving when she noticed her hands trembling on the steering wheel and her shallow, almost breathless breath. The city seemed dead. Empty streets, flashing lights, the constant sound of rain like a suspenseful soundtrack that never ended. At every corner, the image of the note came back to her. She heard the shaky handwriting, the mud, the smell of the underground lingering on the paper. Finch had taken Megan, there was no doubt, and there was no power in the world that could make her stop now. She accelerated, cutting through the cold dawn wind, the underground map open on the passenger seat. Sector E, that unmarked spot, was now the only possible destination. Finch was no ordinary predator. He knew the city like no one else, the tunnels, the exits, the flaws in the system, and more than that, he saw himself as part of it, as if the underground were alive and he were merely the messenger. Lara now understood the pattern, the cycle no one wanted to see. Every 10 years, the disappearances returned, and 1994 marked precisely the next interval. The path to the alternative entrance was a blur of adrenaline and memories. The sound of tires on the water mingled with the voices his mind kept replaying. His daughter's cries, the echo of children on the walls, Finch's whisper, too late. When he reached the alley, the same one he'd entered days before, the iron gate was ajar. A glimmer of hope. Maybe there was still time. He grabbed the flashlight, the recorder, and the revolver he kept hidden in the glove compartment. He descended the stairs without hesitation. Downstairs the air was heavier than ever. The temperature had risen as if the ground itself were breathing. With each step, Lara felt the floor vibrate slightly, a muffled sound, almost like a distant murmur. The damp walls seemed narrower, the ceiling lower. The musty smell now mingled with another, something metallic, acidic, that she recognized from other crime scenes. Blood. The main corridor split into 3 routes, and she instinctively chose the middle one, following the sound of dripping water and something that sounded like faint crying. "It's me, Megan, it's me, love," she murmured, her voice breaking. The sound stopped for a moment, then returned, louder, closer. The flashlight trembled in her hands. The hallway ended in a cracked wall, but there was a small opening through which a beam of orange light came. Lara ducked and slipped through. What she saw on the other side froze her. It was a large chamber, made of old concrete, covered in damp. On the floor, dozens of old toys were scattered. Dolls, cars, water-soaked children's books. In the center, a row of small, rusty metal beds. Some were empty, others not. Pale, motionless bodies, as if time had stopped there. Lara put her hand to her mouth to stifle a scream. The sound that emerged was a choked sob, pure despair. She walked between the beds, the sound of her own footsteps echoing, and then she heard something that made her heart drop. Breathing. In the darkest corner of the room, beneath a dim, flickering light, a small figure stirred. "Megan!" She ran, knelt, and pulled her daughter's frail body into her arms. The girl was alive, covered in mud, her eyes open but unfocused. She trembled and mumbled incoherent sentences. He said the ground spoke, that I should hear it too." Lara wept, hugging her tightly, trying to bring back what was left of her. It's okay. Mommy's here." But the moment was short-lived. A metallic sound echoed behind them, coming from the darkness. Shuffling footsteps, the click of a lamp turning on. Finch. He walked slowly, his face partially illuminated, his eyes fixed on them both. "She heard, didn't she?" he asked, his tone almost satisfied. "Now understand, this is how the city breathes. With each generation, the underground chooses who will listen." Lara stood, holding Megan behind her. The revolver trembled in her hands. "It's over, Harold. You're going to pay for all this." He laughed, a hoarse, painful sound. "You think I did this? I just obey. The underground showed me where they were trapped. I got them out of the rain like I got your brother out." The last sentence hit her like a bullet. "Daniel," she whispered. "Was he here?" Finch smiled. "Still is." Before she could respond, a deafening crash shook the ground. The walls began to vibrate, chunks of concrete falling. Finch dropped the lantern and stepped away. "He's awake," he murmured, staring at the ceiling. Lara scooped Megan up and began to run, stumbling over the rubble. The tunnel behind them was collapsing, the sound of it collapsing like the roar of something alive. Finch disappeared into the dust, swallowed by darkness. Lara only caught the brief flash of his eyes before everything collapsed. She ran without looking back, following the wind that came from the surface. Her heart was pounding, her legs burning. Megan cried, clutching the stuffed rabbit to her chest. When she finally saw the light, a relief mixed with panic washed over her. She climbed the steps, pushed open the cover, and the cold Seattle rain fell on them both. The sounds of the city returned, sirens, thunder, life continuing outside as if nothing had happened. Lara fell to her knees in the middle of the street, hugging her daughter tightly. Megan was shaking but breathing. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Mommy," he said, "there's more." Lara didn't answer. She just looked back at the hole they'd climbed out of, now covered in debris and water. The underground seemed calm again, quiet, but the wind coming from there carried a distant sound, a sound she would never forget. It sounded like a child's laughter, and in that moment, even with Megan alive in her arms, Lara understood that the search wasn't over, because the Seattle Underground had swallowed Finch, but not what he represented. That place, that labyrinth beneath the city, still held voices, and maybe, just maybe, some of them were still waiting to be heard. The city seemed to breathe a strange silence in the days that followed. The Pioneer Square case exploded in newspapers, on radio everywhere. Headlines spoke of a secret tunnel network, of a miraculous rescue, but no one really knew what had happened down there. The police tried to piece together a plausible narrative, but nothing fit. Lara, on the captain's direct orders, was removed for psychological evaluation. She laughed when she heard this, a hollow, humorless laugh, because it wasn't her sanity that was at stake. It was the truth, and no one wanted to face what lay beneath the city. In the hospital, Megan slept most of the time. The doctors said it was normal, a state of shock, but Lara knew something was different. Her daughter murmured in her sleep, short, disjointed words, sometimes names, sometimes just numbers. One night, Lara leaned closer and heard clearly, 10, 12, 17. The girl's voice was almost a whisper. Lara recorded it, not understanding what it meant, but the sequence of numbers kept ringing in her head. Meanwhile, Harold Finch's body was never found. The tunnel where he had been trapped had completely collapsed, and rescuers declared the area impassable. Officially, he was presumed dead, but Lara knew, or at least sensed, that it was too easy. Finch was the type who thrives in dark corners, the type the city forgets, and even though he was dead, something in him remained there, trapped underground. Days turned into weeks. Seattle went on with its usual routine, but for Lara, everything felt different. The streets seemed emptier, the wind colder. The sewers emitted a thick steam that carried a rusty smell. She began to notice little things, the sound of pipes vibrating at night, the sensation of the ground pulsing beneath her feet, and the distant sound of footsteps always coming from below. She tried to ignore it, telling herself it was just trauma, that her body was still reacting to fear. But deep inside, something told her it wasn't. Over. One grey afternoon, while reviewing reports at home, he found an envelope left in the mailbox with no return address. Inside, a single photograph. It was a blurry image, taken in low light, but he recognized the location immediately. Sector E, the same tunnel where he'd rescued Megan. In the corner of the photo, a silhouette. Tall, thin, with his back turned. Finch. And what made her freeze wasn't his presence. It was the detail just below, on the walls. New handprints. Small, fresh. If the cycle had begun again. That night, Lara was called to the police station. The captain, with a heavy look in his eyes, said they needed to talk. 2 new disappearances had been reported. Children from different neighborhoods, both last seen playing near manhole covers. Her stomach turned. "You're not saying that," she began, but he interrupted. "I'm not saying anything, McConnell. I just want you to understand. The city is old, full of stories. Sometimes it's better to let what's down there continue sleeping." She stood up slowly, looked at him and replied, "Sleeping? Do you really think that thing sleeps?" She left the police station feeling the weight of déjà vu. The same rain, the same wind, the same smell of mud. Everything was the same as the day it all began. She drove aimlessly for a while until she parked at the edge of Lake Union. She watched the reflection of the city lights on the water, trying to understand where truth ended and fear began. The moon's reflection trembled on the surface, and for a moment she thought she saw something move beneath the water like a shadow. She rolled down the window, listened closely, and the sound was there. A muffled rumble coming from deep below. The car radio turned on by itself, emitting only a hiss. Lara hung up, but it turned back on, this time with a distorted recording, a childish voice saying, "It's dark in here. Mommy?" Her blood ran cold. She recognized the voice. Megan. But her daughter was asleep at home, under the care of the nurse. She picked up her cell phone and called to confirm. She rang twice, 3 times, and nothing. She put the car in gear and sped home, her heart hammering so loudly that the sound of the engine seemed distant. When he arrived, the lights were off in the house. He called for his daughter, but only the echo answered. Megan's room was untouched. The blanket was tucked in, the toys in place. On the bed was the recorder Lara had used during the investigation. He turned it on, his hands shaking. The tape began with the sound of heavy breathing, followed by Megan's soft voice. "Mommy told me not to listen," but he called again. The sound that followed was something she could never describe. It wasn't human, a mix of whisper and roar, as if the entire floor had spoken. Lara dropped the recorder, fell to her knees, and her terror gave way to absolute despair. The phone rang. She answered without thinking. On the other end, silence. Then a low, drawn-out, familiar laugh. "I told you, the underground never sleeps." She glanced out the window. Outside, the street was quiet, but in the gutter, right next to the iron manhole cover, a new crack was beginning to open. The rain was slowly running down, trickling into the crack, as if something down there was drinking. Lara dropped the phone and took a step back. The sound continued, now louder, closer, and it was in that moment, between panic and lucidity, that she realized the police weren't going to help, that the reports were useless. This wasn't a case anymore, it was a call, an echo from the depths, and deep down, she knew exactly what she needed to do, because if the Seattle Underground wanted another voice, it hadn't heard hers yet. Her body seemed to be working on autopilot. Fear wasn't the same fear it used to be, the kind that paralyzes, that makes your throat tighten and your body recoil. Now it was a different kind of fear, the kind that moves, the kind that pushes you forward, the kind that transforms an ordinary person into a force that doesn't measure consequences. Lara no longer thought about orders, protocols, or risks. She only thought about Megan. Her daughter was alive somewhere down there, and if Finch thought he was going to take her like the others, he had no idea who he was facing. He spent the entire night putting together an improvised plan. He gathered flashlights, ropes, a 2-way radio, his old revolver, the map of Sector E, and the tape recorder with his daughter's voice. Every sound on the recording made her shudder, but it also fueled an old rage, the same one that had haunted her since her brother's disappearance. At 6 in the morning, he parked on the same street where it all began. The light rain fell relentlessly, turning the asphalt into a dirty mirror. On the passenger seat was a thermos of coffee she didn't even remember making. Before getting out, she took a deep breath and glanced in the rearview mirror. Her face looked like someone else's, pale, her eyes red, her hair tied up messily. "It's going to be now," she murmured, more to herself than anything else. She lowered the iron manhole cover and began to descend. The air below was warm, dense, pulsing again. With each step, the sensation of entering something alive grew stronger. It was as if the underground were breathing. This time, she wasn't alone. George Ellison, the retired firefighter who had helped with underground searches years earlier, appeared at the tunnel entrance minutes later. "I thought you wouldn't come," she said hoarsely. He simply replied, "I have grandchildren." That was enough. They descended in silence, each footstep echoing against the concrete walls. George carried a portable heat detector, the kind used in rescues. When he turned it on, small lights began to flash. There was movement ahead, not far away. Lara swallowed hard and pointed the flashlight in the indicated direction. The tunnel split into 2 routes, an old one, partially collapsed, and a new one, apparently with tire tracks and piles of wood. Finch had used that entrance recently. "He's not dead," George said, breaking the silence. Lara just nodded. The footprints on the ground, one large, firm one and several small, scattered ones, confirmed what she'd already feared. Finch had not only survived the collapse, he was active again, and now he had Megan. As they advanced, the sound of rushing water grew louder. The tunnel spiraled downward, and the air grew heavier and heavier. At one point, Lara noticed something that made her heart race. On the walls, drawings made with colored chalk, like children's scribbles. Clouds, houses, stick figures, and among them a phrase repeated over and over, in crooked letters, "Below the city, the sun never sets." George looked at her confused. "What does that mean?" he asked. Lara replied softly, "That they lived here." They kept walking until the detector began to beep louder. Intense heat came from a rust-covered metal door ahead. Lara pressed her ear against it. Silence. He tried the handle, but it was locked. George grabbed an iron bar and began banging until the lock gave way. The door opened with a loud crack, and the hot air that escaped was almost suffocating. The space beyond looked like a mix of shelter and macabre sanctuary. There were unlit candles, old photos taped to the walls, and, in the center, a chair facing a small television, which was on, broadcasting only static. Above the screen, a tape with the name McConnell taped to it. Lara felt her body freeze. He walked to the TV, removed the tape, and looked around. George kept the flashlight trained on the opposite wall, where something had been drawn in dark ink. It was hands again, hundreds of them, overlapping, forming a pattern that stretched from floor to ceiling. Suddenly the television hissed, and an image began to appear on its own, even without a tape in the set. The screen showed Finch's face, dirty, bruised, smiling. "You're back," he said, looking straight into the camera. "I knew you would. Everyone comes back when they hear the voices." Lara tried to turn off the monitor, but the button wouldn't work. "She's with me, Lara. And unlike the others, she hears everything. The underground chose her. She doesn't fight it. She accepts it." George tugged at Lara's arm. "Let's get out of here. This is a trap." But she didn't move. She stared at the screen, unblinking. And then, a familiar sound came from inside the television. Megan's voice. "Mommy, help!" The scream pierced her chest like a blade. Without thinking, she grabbed the flashlight and started running through the adjacent hallways. George tried to follow her, shouting her name, but the sound was lost in the tunnels. Her breathing was pure fury mixed with despair. The walls seemed to close in, the sound of her own heart echoing along with the water dripping from the ceiling, until, as she rounded a corner, she saw a faint light far below. He ran, stumbled, braced himself against the walls. The light grew with each step. "Megan!" he shouted, his voice hoarse. No answer, only the distant sound of something dragging. When she finally arrived, she found what appeared to be an old control room, cluttered with cables and broken monitors. In the center, a figure knelt, facing away. Her hair was blonde, the same shade as her daughter's. "Megan!" She approached slowly, her heart racing. She touched the girl's shoulder, and the body fell to the side limp. A mannequin. The face was fake, molded, but the clothes were her daughter's. Before she could react, a voice echoed behind her. "You don't understand, Lara. They come back. They all come back." Finch emerged from the shadows, his eyes shining in the dim light. "You think you rescue them, but you just switch places. One goes up, one goes down. That's how the underground breathes." Lara raised her revolver, the barrel trembling. "Where is she?" Finch just smiled, pointing to the ceiling, where a crack was slowly opening, spilling mud and water. "The city's opening its mouth again." And at that moment, the heat detector George carried began beeping frantically. Several moving heat spots were approaching, dozens of them. George came running, shouting her name. The sound of his footsteps echoed everywhere. Lara looked around and saw small, countless shadows moving quickly across the walls. Children's voices whispered meaningless phrases. "He said he'd come back. He said." "The sun sleeps." Lara pulled George along and ran, the tunnel vibrating beneath her feet. Finch stood there, smiling, until he disappeared into the darkness, swallowed by the same noise that shook the ground. The exit was close, but the sound behind them was deafening. Lara knew she couldn't stop, not yet. The entire underground seemed alive, pulsing, breathing, and amidst the chaos, a certainty grew within her. Megan was in there somewhere, and she wouldn't leave without finding her. The air below began to change. It was more than a sound, more than the cracking of concrete. It was a sensation, a presence. The ground vibrated beneath their feet as if the underground were waking from a long slumber. Lara and George ran, but the tunnel seemed to fold in on itself, transforming into a maze that changed with every turn. Children's voices echoed off the walls, now close, now distant, as if the air itself were playing tricks on them. "He said the sun sleeps," they repeated in chorus, growing louder and louder, increasingly unbearable. George stumbled, fell, and Lara pulled him by the arm, shouting to keep going. "Don't look back, George, just run!" The heat detector beeped incessantly, marking several moving points, but now there was no clear direction. The flashlight's lights flickered and the beam barely penetrated the dust. The smell of iron and wet earth grew so strong it seemed to fill her lungs. They turned a corner, and suddenly Lara stopped. Ahead, a half-open iron door, identical to the ones in old photos of Finch's inspections. Behind it, a dim light flickered, the same orange she'd seen the night she rescued Megan. She knew, without thinking, that it was there. "This is where he took them," she whispered. George shook his head, hesitant. "Lara, there's no time. This place is going to fall down." But she had already pushed open the door and entered. What she saw made her whole body freeze. It was a huge room, carved into the raw concrete, with ancient columns and hanging wires. In the center, a metal structure that resembled a covered well. Around it, dozens of toys, necklaces, shoes, and children's objects were scattered like offerings. And there, leaning against the wall, Megan. The girl was alive, dirty, her eyes wide, trembling. Lara ran to her, knelt, and hugged her so tightly it seemed she wanted to fuse them both into one body. Megan cried, the words coming out in sobs. He tried to make me listen, Mommy. He said if I listened, you would too." Lara caressed her face, smeared with mud and dried blood. "It's okay, love, it's over. I'm here. It's over." But the girl shook her head. "He didn't leave. He's here." And before Lara could respond, a laugh echoed through the tunnel. A hoarse, scratchy laugh that came from all sides at once. Finch. His figure loomed across the room, half-shadowed, his face smeared with dirt, his eyes bloodshot. "You don't understand, Lara. I don't bring them here. I just open the door." He walked. Slowly, his steps firm. The underground wants what's above. It wants to trade. One goes, one stays. Lara pointed the gun at him, her heart pounding so loudly it filled her ears. "If you take one more step, I swear I'll shoot." Finch gave a wry smile, raising his hands. "Shoot then. But remember what he said. The ground chooses." And at that moment, the sound returned. That deep roar that seemed to come from the depths. The metal well in the center of the room began to vibrate. The lids shifted. The hot air rose in waves and voices began to escape from it. Dozens of voices, all of them children, crying, laughing, calling. George appeared behind her, shouting, "Lara, get out of there, now!" But she couldn't move her legs. The voices called her name. They called Megan. They called Daniel. It was as if the entire underground was alive, mixing memories and screams, trying to pull her in. Finch laughed louder, holding out his arms. "See? He wants you now. He always has." Lara took a deep breath, squeezed the trigger, and the shot echoed like thunder. Finch fell, his body hitting the ground with a dull thud. For a second, silence filled the tunnel. The voices ceased, the air still. Lara gathered Megan in her arms, trying to find the exit, but the floor began to give way. George screamed again, pulling them both along. The walls shook, chunks of concrete fell, and the shaft in the center opened wide, revealing a dark, deep hole, the end in plain sight. The wind coming. Out was so strong it pulled everything around it. Toys, debris, bodies. Lara held Megan tightly, screaming for help, and George grabbed a pipe, reaching out to them. "Catch!" he shouted, but the wind was picking up. The sound was deafening. Lara looked at Megan, her eyes brimming with tears. "Close your eyes, love, just close your eyes." With a jerk, she threw the girl forward, straight into George's arms. He managed to catch her, but the effort made him let go of the bar and fall to his knees. "Lara!" he shouted. She still tried to hold on, but the ground beneath her feet was crumbling. Finch, hurt, looked at her and whispered, "Now you understand." And then the ground gave way. Her body plummeted, swallowed by the darkness. The sound of the wind mingled with Megan's cries and George's distant shout. For long seconds, only the sound of emptiness. Then, silence. The surface of Seattle was calm, the rain continued to fall, and the city, as always, pretended nothing had happened. But, down there, deep within, a faint light flickered. A flashlight was on, still recording. The last sound captured was breathing, faint, slow, and a voice, almost a whisper, saying, she heard. The rain continued to fall on Seattle when firefighters finally reached the surface of Sector E. The city still slept, unaware of what was happening beneath their feet. Megan was found unconscious in George's arms, covered in mud, with her stuffed rabbit pressed to her chest. She was breathing but saying nothing. Her eyes remained open, staring blankly, as if still staring into the underground. George, exhausted, could barely explain what he had seen. He kept repeating the same phrase, like a man who had seen the impossible. She fell. The ground took her. The following weeks were a blur. The case exploded in the press with horror headlines and absurd theories. Some said Lara McConnell had gone mad. Others said she had discovered something the government wanted to hide. Authorities cordoned off the entire area and sealed off the access roads, promising demolitions and increased security. But everyone knew this was just to calm the town. No official report mentioned the voices, the toys, or the well. None. It was as if the story had been buried along with her. Megan remained silent for months. The psychologist said the trauma was too great, that her brain was trying to protect itself. But every now and then, during the night, the girl would get up and walk to the window. She would watch the rain fall on the streets, her eyes vacant, and whisper softly, "She's still there." The nurse thought it was a child trying to cope with loss, but George knew better. He heard it too. Sometimes when the wind blew through the storm drains, the sound was the same. A familiar, drawn-out whisper saying words he preferred not to understand. A month later, during a routine inspection, a city engineer found a new crack near Pioneer Square. A small one, but with something strange. The edges were marked with mud, and on the cement were the prints of a single hand, an adult's. The team sealed the site immediately, but word got out. "Another hole," residents said. "The city is sinking." No one talked about Lara, but everyone remembered the detective who defied orders, who went down alone and never returned. George visited Megan from time to time. He brought her flowers and tried to talk, but she rarely spoke. One day, he arrived early and found her drawing. The paper was covered in lines and circles, the same pattern Lara had found on the walls of the underground. In the center, a female figure holding a flashlight. George asked what it was, and Megan replied, without taking her eyes off the drawing, "She's showing the others the way." He felt his body freeze. Winter arrived again in Seattle, and with it, the same kind of rain that started it all. The streets flooded again, and the storm drains began to belch hot steam. Some people swore they heard children's laughter in the early hours of the morning, mixed with the sound of rushing water. Others said they occasionally saw a shadow cross the reflection of the underground tunnels in the puddles, but no one dared to check. At the police station, Lara's old mural was still there. The map with the red circles, the photos of the missing children, the notes taped together. The new chief wanted to remove it all, but Miller, now promoted, asked to leave it. "It's part of the city's history," he said, his eyes weary. Sometimes during the late nights on duty, he thought he heard footsteps in the empty hallway, as if someone was still walking along. He never said anything, but he left the flashlight on, pointing it at the floor. One of those nights, a trainee working in the archives came into the room and asked, "Sergeant, have you seen this?" On the desk was an old, unlabeled folder with the name McConnell scrawled by hand. Miller opened it. Inside, a single sheet. No report, no photo, just an audio transcript with one short sentence, dated a week after the collapse. Recovered recording, November 28, 1994. Source, underground frequency, 104.7 Hz, female voice identified. Below the words transcribed, "Megan, the sun is up. I'm here." Miller was silent for a moment. Then, without saying anything, he closed his briefcase and looked out the window. The rain was falling lightly, the asphalt reflecting the city lights. Outside, a child was crossing the street with a red umbrella. For a moment, the sergeant thought he saw a woman walking beside her, head down holding a flashlight. He blinked and the image vanished. All that remained was the wet street and the steady sound of water running down the drains. And in that silence, between the wind and the sound of the rain, there seemed to be something new, an echo, a whisper, a reminder that even after all this time, Seattle's underground was still breathing, still calling, and that, perhaps, Lara McConnell's voice hadn't been lost down there, just mingled with those who never wanted to be silent again. Now that you've made it this far, you've already realized how this story captivated you from beginning to end. And perhaps you felt that chill that only appears when something inside us recognizes that that it could have been a true story, experienced by a real person. It was intense, wasn't it? Every detail, every twist, every secret of the Seattle underground showed you how much darker the truth can be than we imagine. And that's exactly why these kinds of stories need to keep being told. Somehow you've been here with Lara. You've felt the tension, the pain, the fear, and the relief of each discovery. And that's what makes it all worth it. Now, the one who can make this story reach more people is you. By clicking like that's it, subscribing on the channel, you help other people hear voices that were almost lost and show that this type of content still has people listening. And let me tell you something. What comes next is even more disturbing. The next story begins with a simple phone call made in the middle of the night and ends with a secret that has been hidden for almost 20 years. So let's just, activates the enrollment and comment below the word echo to show that you too have heard the call of the underground. Now take a deep breath, watch the video that's appearing on the screen, and prepare your heart, because the next disappearance will make you doubt what is coincidence and what is destiny.